All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. I believe we are on episode 96 of this podcast series. We're continuing to read High Risers by Ben Austen. We are on page 76. Just like the Italian slum that preceded it, Cabrini-Green's location, only blocks from the Gold Coast, added to its emerging infamy. 12 other police officers have been killed in the previous 18 months in an increasingly violent Chicago, with 11 of those murders occurring on the South Side. In Inglewood, an officer was sitting in his squad car filling out paperwork when someone walked up and shot him point blank. By 1970, however, most white Chicagoans rarely spent time in South Side neighborhoods like Inglewood, and they probably passed the Robert Taylor homes only in a speeding car along the Dan Ryan Expressway. But Cabrini-Green remained that uncommon frontier where white Chicagoans still crossed paths with poor blacks. They drove or even walked by Cabrini-Green with some regularity. People from Lincoln Park, Old Town, and the river districts by the Loop regarded their housing projects as a place to avoid or to go to for felonious offerings. They followed the reporters in the media of late-night violent crime at Cabrini as if hearing about a near miss. The city's news team, too, needed only to look in their own backyard to cover another grim story on public housing life. In the days and weeks after Severin and Rosado were murdered, every incident at or even near Cabrini-Green received extensive news coverage, with journalists exercising their more Norrish proclivities doing their best Nelson Algreen. The on and off gunfire became a, quote, special kind of rain, end quote. The thousands of children at Cabrini were, quote, clenched in a cold concrete and steel fist of 70 acres, end quote. Sorry about that. A Chicago Tribune editorial titled, quote, Near North Hell, end quote, reviving the old Little Hell moniker, described the development as a, quote, Hydra's head of problems and, like the mythical monster, as one problem is cut away, two more come to take its place, end quote. The Chicago Sun-Times ran a special series in which it sent a black staff writer, actually a college student, an intern, who was promoted for the assignment, to live for a time at Cabrini-Green, the newspaper publishing his dispatches as if they were being filed from the jungles of South Vietnam. Quote, for several days, he lived there, talked with residents, roamed the dingy corridors and littered playground, played ball with his teeming young, end quote. Thus, Cabrini-Green, after the cop killings, became both a real place with an array of actual problems and an abstraction. In short order, Cabrini-Green was the setting for the Norman Lear primetime sitcom Good Times, which told the story of a family of five struggling nobly in their two-bedroom, one-bathroom public housing apartment. James Evans, the family patriarch, orders his youngest son to his room after he's suspended from middle school for calling George Washington a slave-holding racist. Quote, but, Daddy, this is my room. I'm the little fellow who sleeps on the couch, end quote. Good Times was one of the most watched programs on television, behind All in the Family, Sanford and Son, Chico and the Man, and The Jeffersons, all of them playing to the country's fixation on issues of race and class and upheaval in inner cities. Eric Monty, one of the creators of Good Times, grew up in the Cabrini row houses. And the movie he wrote based on his teenage years there, Cooley High, was marketed as the Black American Graffiti. For the 1970s urban crime novel, The Horror of Cabrini-Green, the cover copy promised, quote, inside Chicago's worst public housing project and a young man's vicious struggle to survive, end quote. Each of these representations of Cabrini-Green added to the myth and also came to shape the reality there. During one brutal stretch of pages in The Horror of Cabrini-Green, an 8-year-old is raped, the police shoot a child who stole a bag of potato chips, and the 16-year-old narrator, Bosco, and other members of his gang break into a neighborhood church and hang the priest. Quote, damn, it sure is a violent day, ain't it? End quote, one of Bosco's friends observes nonchalantly, suggesting they might head over to another high-rise to check out the pummeling of a boy they knew. Quote, Shorty and I agree that it was definitely a violent day, end quote, Bosco relates. Quote, we went over to watch Jesse get his ass whipped, end quote. In a public housing newsletter, a media relations official at the CHA addressed the outsized place Cabrini-Green came to hold in the civic imagination. Quote, Cabrini-Green now stood for something more than a public housing development in Chicago named for a Catholic saint and a labor leader. It also spelled fear in the minds of the citizens of the city and the residents of the project, end quote. Defining Cabrini-Green as the big civic problem also meant it couldn't be ignored. It needed to be dealt with, solved. Quote, as though by focusing on this one community and isolating it, end quote, the CHA official said of the sudden obsession with all things Cabrini, quote, they could exorcise the violence, the crime, the poverty, and the racial fears of the city, end quote. And that brings us to a changing of the themes. And I think one of the things to point out here is again, the importance of, I think that is, and we sort of talked about this in Women, Race, and Class, which we read two pieces of literature ago. But Angela Davis spoke about how when Uncle Tom's Cabin was written, how it served to illustrate the issues that Black people in slavery were dealing with. It served to push forward the movement for abolition, but it served to inform people who may have been uninformed or ill-informed about slavery. But it also served to perpetuate certain stereotypes and perpetuate certain prejudices that existed within America about Black people and about slavery. And I think the same thing can be said to be true here. As important as it is for these news stories to illustrate the realities of what was going on in Cabrini-Green, as important as it is for television shows and movies and books to illustrate the realities of what was going on in Cabrini-Green and in Chicago, it also serves, depending on which way that these things are being presented to people, it also can serve to perpetuate stereotypes. It can also serve to it also can be exploitative of the people who deal with these realities. The question can be asked: how much money that was generated from Good Times went back to trying to fix the issues that people were dealing with inside the Cabrini-Green homes that Good Times was based on? What, besides telling these news stories that Chicago Sun-Times was doing to get more people to buy their paper and to read their paper, what were they doing to try to alleviate these realities that people inside Cabrini-Green were living with? And I think that's something that we have to be aware of, often because we live in a capitalistic society. There is a hint of exploitation that goes on when people speak about certain social issues. And I think that's just something it just bears mentioning. Cabrini-Green's newfound notoriety brought Jesse Jackson out to the housing project. In 1970, Jackson was running the Chicago chapter of Operation Breadbasket, the branch of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference focused on improving economic conditions in African American communities. At a news conference in front of the high-rises, he praised Severin and Rosado while evocatively calling Cabrini-Green, quote, the Soul Coast on the Gold Coast, end quote. He also said he was acting as spokesperson for a new group named the People's Organization of Cabrini-Green. The People's Organization pointed out that Cabrini-Green had as many inhabitants as most suburban villages or towns, yet it lacked almost all of their services and amenities. They demanded better street lighting. They wanted child care facilities, a medically staffed emergency room, and 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools, an average of 1 for every 5,700 people there. The organization also insisted that a Black-owned company be hired to operate security at the housing project. Quote, Black men are good enough to work as military police in Vietnam, end quote, Jackson proclaimed. Quote, why can't there be policemen right here in the Chicago police force, end quote. Jackson sent a telegram to President Nixon requesting federal disaster relief for Cabrini-Green. While the housing development had not, quote, suffered either a natural or man-made catastrophe in the normal sense, end quote, Jackson wrote to Nixon, quote, the area must be considered a disaster area to the potentially riotous conditions accompanying the resultant tension, end quote. Nixon responded to Jackson's request, dispatching George Romney, his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, to Cabrini-Green. Romney, the former Michigan governor, had lost the Republican primary to Nixon 2 years earlier, going from presidential frontrunner to also ran in a few blundering weeks. A moderate Republican compared with Nixon, he reached on his own the same conclusion as the federal commissions that had studied the causes of recent inner-city unrest. Segregation was destroying America. In his new cabinet position, he planned to use public housing to move African Americans out of urban ghettos and into thriving suburbs. In Chicago, in 1969, a federal judge had ordered the CHA to do exactly that, ruling that the placement of the city's public housing developments in predominantly black neighborhoods fostered segregation and was in direct violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The class action housing desegregation lawsuit against the CHA was named for Dorothy Gutrue, who lived in an all-black Alt-Ged Gardens on the distant South Side. Although the judge ruled in favor of the Gutrue plaintiffs, the case would be fought for years, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And Mayor Daley chose to put an end to almost all public housing construction rather than follow the court decree and build in white neighborhoods. From 1969 to 1980, Chicago would add little more than 100 public housing units. Romney believed he could withhold federal assistance to any suburbs unwilling to add public housing as part of his Open Communities initiative. Already an outsider in Nixon's White House, the housing secretary decided to develop this desegregation program without revealing it to the president. The plan would not go over well when it went public. And I think something that's important to point out here is this sentence right here. And Mayor Daley chose to put an end to almost all public housing construction rather than follow the court decree and build in white neighborhoods. And that's something that happened in multiple states and multiple cities during this time period, during the end of the 60s, during the 70s, and really just in the 20th century as a whole, is if people were in the process of, whether it be the construction company itself or whether it be the government, if they were being told that they had to build the public housing in areas where white people lived, they would stop building the public housing. Or if the choice was you can build public housing, but you have to make it integrated public housing, they would choose to have no public housing. And so it's important to point out that some of these decisions could have been made to help alleviate the type of violence, the type of discrimination, the type of issues that existed in the public housing system that was in place at the time. But when they had the opportunities to try to alleviate those burdens, they chose to not. They wanted to put poverty on top of poverty. They wanted to keep black people isolated among other black people. They had no desire to try to uplift these people who were going to be in public housing. They just wanted them to be out of sight, out of mind. And so they bear blame for the issues that existed in public housing. But first, Romney toured Cabrini-Green. On a steamy August day, 2 weeks after the cop killings, he and Jesse Jackson walked the housing development. It was a strange scene. Romney moved at a typical breakneck pace, while members of the Operation Breadbasket and the People's Organization of Cabrini-Green formed a scrum around the two men, pushing aside reporters and residents. Jackson took the HUD security to the field where Severin and Rosado had been gunned down, pointing out the sniper's nest above. Romney and Jackson hustled over to 1150 through 1160 North Sedgwick, the Rock, entering one of the apartments. With an entourage jogging to keep up, they surveyed the expanse of concrete surrounding the towers and the tiny public swimming pool that locals dubbed, quote, the bathtub, end quote. In St. Dominic's Church, residents told Romney about the conditions in Cabrini-Green. The rats in the broken elevators, the single mothers willing away the days without hope, the gangs and the drugs, the promises of jobs and services that never came, the police reminding them with a drawn gun or a curse to stay put on their island of 70 acres. Romney was convinced. He announced that security alone wouldn't be able to solve the problems at Cabrini-Green, and he left. Jackson, finding himself alone in front of the reporters, declared the day an extraordinary success. Yet conditions at Cabrini-Green only worsened. Out of punishment and fear, the city stopped regular trash pickup. Residents, too, no longer thought about their home the same way. The murders and the police response brought many to a breaking point. Distressed over their own safety, elderly tenants were allowed to transfer to senior housing elsewhere. More than 700 families moved out of Cabrini-Green by year's end, a fifth of the 3,600 households, almost all of them coming from the high-risers. Many people on the public housing waiting list opted to wait longer rather than accept a vacant unit in Cabrini-Green, which they heard so much about of late. Those who did move in were generally poorer and less stable than the tenants they replaced, and the portion of families on welfare and headed by a single parent both jumped to 3/4 of the total. The reality at Cabrini edged ever closer to the idea of it in people's minds. Mayor Daley visited the White House in May 1971, telling Nixon that racial fears had wrecked public housing in Chicago. Quote, "In some portions, there are 750 vacancies in Cabrini-Green, and white people won't move in," end quote, Daley said. Quote, "What kind of a thing is it?" Quote, Nixon asked of the public housing development. Quote, "It's a white high-rise, though it's all black, but it's a high-rise with a high percentage of crime," end quote. The urban planner, Oscar Newman, pointed to the design of high-rise public housing to illustrate his theory about the role that physical layout plays in abetting or preventing crime. Newman contended that super block public housing lacked what he called, quote, "defensible space," end quote, and therefore represented the worst of post-war modernist architecture. The towers were without through streets or commercial establishments, creating dead zones with no sense of shared ownership or communal supervision. That's where crime was at its highest. In the words of Jane Jacobs, whose anti-modernist vision from the death and life of great American cities guided a new breed of city planners, superblocks prohibited the self-regulating public safety from, quote, "eyes on the street," end quote, and the, quote, "normal presence of adults on lively sidewalks," end quote. In public housing projects, the majority of the violent crimes occurred in isolated and unmonitored stairwells, laundry rooms, and elevators. City officials joked that the most dangerous public transportation in Chicago was a Cabrini-Green elevator. When HUD had discretionary funds available for improvements at its most troubled public housing developments, the sensationalized coverage of Cabrini-Green left little doubt where the money would go. Quote, "We wanted to find the worst of the worst public housing projects," end quote, a HUD official said. Quote, "The ones that because of physical deterioration, bad maintenance, problem families, or overwhelming social conditions were really in trouble and need to be turned around. There were a number of factors considered, but in Chicago, everyone knows that means Cabrini-Green," end quote. With the federal money that soon came, and in conjunction with funding from several state, county, and city agencies, the CHA began a $21 million security pilot program at Cabrini-Green to combat its structural deficiencies. The lobbies in 4 of the high-rises were reconstructed. Access to the buildings were curtailed, with guard stations built to block anyone from entering without first being screened. Bright lights were installed, as were vandal-proof mailboxes, polycarbonate glazed safety windows, and toilets in the lobbies, so children wouldn't relieve themselves in the stairwells. The 4 towers were outfitted as well with all-weather cameras that could capture images in the dark and with state-of-the-art closed-circuit TV systems for monitoring the elevators, stairwells, and perimeters of the buildings. The areas outside the high-rises were to be surrounded by chain link and wrought iron fencing, brightly lit, and turned into grassy courtyards so as to, quote, "increase the territoriality of individual buildings," end quote, though these changes were never enacted. Neither was the promise to focus on, quote, "diversion as well as prevention," end quote, measures that were to include new social service programs for drug and alcohol abuse, for juvenile offenders, for school assistants, and for women to learn self-defense and problem-solving strategies. This investment in Cabrini-Green, as incomplete as it was, came at a time when other cities were already giving up on their public housing high-rises. Like Cabrini-Green, St. Louis's Pruitt-Igoe was a large public housing development consisting of 33 identical 11-story towers and a total of 2,870 units. It fell into incredible despair in a remarkably short time. The buildings were built poorly to start, without a sufficient number of playgrounds and with doorknobs and locks that broke upon first use. The St. Louis Housing Authority, too, was underfunded and inefficient, and Pruitt-Igoe residents rapidly became overwhelmingly poor, with the majority of their households headed by single mothers. And so in 1972, Just 18 years after the high-rises were completed, the Pruitt-Igoe towers were imploded with charges of dynamite. The televised image, with its mushrooming cloud of dust and debris, defined for many the popular notion of the public housing experiment. It had failed. The vision of decaying high-rises wasn't representative of the country as a whole, even if it reflected the realities in cities like Chicago and St. Louis. 3/4 of the nation's public housing units were not in high-rises. And then I want to take a moment to... Okay, let's keep reading. We got a little bit left in this before it's a changing of the theme, so let's just keep reading. No doubt there were many in Chicago who wished to do the same to the city's public housing towers. But the idea of demolishing Cabrini-Green seemed like a political as well as a practical impossibility. It would involve the displacement of some 15,000 poor black Chicagoans. In the previous decades, when slums were cleared, those displaced were sent into public housing. Now, where could people from the projects be sent? After hearing so much about their criminal exploits in the news, what neighborhoods would be willing to absorb them? Sure enough, when suburban areas learned about George Romney's Open Communities proposal, they objected hostily, and the program was scrapped before ever getting underway. Instead of pursuing demolition, Chicago declared the security pilot program at Cabrini-Green a success. The first phase was completed at the start of 1977. Studies commissioned by the CHA showed that the renovated buildings experienced a 25% reduction in crime, a 38% drop in vandalism cost, and a 27% increase in tenant employment. The CHA reported that most of the empty units in the renovated high-rises were now occupied. The newspapers ran stories praising the effort, quote, "Sunlight at Cabrini-Green," end quote, quote, "Cabrini-Green revives," end quote, quote, "The Cabrini-Green homes, despite an image of violence and dark despair, has become in the last 2 years a more comfortable place to live," end quote. Hoping to build on the positive reports, the CHA marketed a new and improved Cabrini-Green, distributing an 8-page brochure of upbeat sepia photographs. The agency had in recent years sent mass mailings to families on the welfare rolls, trying to fill empty units in Cabrini-Green and Robert Taylor. But this pamphlet showed a nuclear family of 4 enjoying time in their refined living room, children frolicking in a playground and a pool, and row houses hedged by shrubs and blossoming foliage. Quote, "Cabrini-Green Homes is a community that most Chicagoans think they know all about, and what they think of it is usually all bad," end quote, the brochure offered as a corrective. Quote, "Located in the heart of Chicago's vibrant near North Side, Cabrini-Green Homes is changing into a place where you can be safe and secure," end quote. The buildings were said to enjoy many of the same security features as the luxury doorman apartments along Lakeshore Drive, but with the rents at a fraction of the cost and convenient off-street parking. Quote, "The Chicago Housing Authority expects great things from the new Cabrini-Green homes, especially when families such as yours move there to help make that dream become a reality," end quote. And so I think what's important to point out about the passages that we just read is how the plans to actually relocate these people, the plans that were actually set in place that would have dealt with the issue head on, instead of trying to propagandize the issue, instead of trying to give window dressing to the issue, were thrown out the window. And I think that it's important that they showed in St. Louis, illustrated how in St. Louis they demolished these high rises because they seen through 16 years that they weren't working, because they were, from the onset, they were put together poorly. And we read about in here how from the onset of Cabrini-Green being created, even though some of the people living inside the Cabrini-Green public housing at the beginning were happy and relieved to not be living in the tenements and living with the conditions that they had before, that when they put these high rises together, they took shortcuts that at first they were supposed to have a certain amount of land, and because of racism and discrimination and prejudice, they wasn't able to use that full amount of land, and so they had to stack these people on top of each other. We read about how throughout the time, from the beginning of the time that these Cabrini-Green was created up until the moment that we're at right here, which is about in the end of the 60s, early 70s, is that the housing was breaking down regularly and that the inside was having all types of maintenance issues. And instead of trying to actually alleviate and solve those problems, instead of being able to admit as a city, as a housing authority, as a government that this has failed, that this has not worked, we have to find something different to do to help these people. They just try to cover it up. They try to put lipstick on the pig, and you see how that continues to perpetuate these issues. And so I think that that's something that we have to also speak about, that in this country, so often because of politics, because of capitalism, because of money and finances, because of people's prejudices, perceptions, and because of stereotypes, people don't want to actually do the work of fixing an issue, of adequately addressing the issue. They just want it they want to take shortcuts. And so we see how shortcuts were taken here in Cabrini-Green, how they just tried to essentially rebrand Cabrini-Green as opposed to trying to fix the issues that the people in Cabrini-Green were living with. We are seeing how because of the perception of Cabrini-Green, how the perception is becoming deeper and deeper ingrained into the reality. We're seeing how the people who are living in Cabrini-Green and who are willing to take a house or home inside of there, how they are in worse and worse conditions, how they are more and more vulnerable people. And because now you have the most vulnerable people all stacked on top of each other, the people in the most poverty, the people with the least stable conditions, living conditions, all stacked on top of each other in a place that is substandard living, you can't be surprised that these issues continue to exist and that this violence and that this crime continues to exist. And I think another one of the things that's important to point out is they're speaking about how high rises in general weren't something that everybody in the nation had. And I don't know, maybe if I haven't been specifying that, I don't know if maybe I'm repeating myself, but I don't know if I have not properly been specifying. I was not under the assumption that the majority of the country had high rises, even though it's good to see this be read here. But the majority of the country was still dealing with public housing in the same manner that Chicago is dealing with public housing. The majority of the country was still not allowing black people to move into white suburban homes. The majority of the country was still disenfranchising the areas and the communities that black people and people of color were living in. But of course, there are some people and we read in here how Jesse Jackson and somebody who was part of Richard Nixon's cabinet, I can't remember, not remembering his name right now. Let's see if I can. Let's only go back a few pages, see if I can find it. But the member of Nixon's cabinet wanted to try to find ways to fix these things. Romney, they wanted to try to fix these things, but that they weren't allowed to do that. And I think another one of the things that's important to point out is they spoke about how money was supposed to be allocated for drug and alcohol abuse centers or programs, for juvenile offender programs, for school assistance programs, for women to learn self-defense and problem-solving strategies. And those programs were never manifested. And instead, they were given more security. That was what they went with. Instead of trying to help to empower people, they went to policing people. They went to law and order, to law enforcement. And that is what has continuously happened for poor people and working class people and people of color in this country, is that they ask for, alongside asking for, because it would be a lie to pretend like that has not been something that people have asked for, people of color have asked for, alongside of asking for more police, or alongside of asking for stricter laws, gun laws, or stricter drug laws, they've also asked for programs that can help young children. They've also asked for programs that can help people who have been caught up in the criminal justice system. They've also asked for better education. They've also asked for better living conditions. And what they've continuously been given is just more police. It's just more money to law enforcement, is more money to the criminal justice system. And they haven't been given resources to programs that can help with self-determination. And so, and that has happened for decade upon decade upon decade. And so when we get to 2022, we have to understand why we can no longer ask for both of those things. We can only ask for one of those things. We need more money to be put into education. We need more money to be put into helping people who are coming out of the criminal justice system. We need more money to be put into better living conditions. And it can't be, we want also to have more money put into policing, or we want stricter laws, because we've seen that when we get stricter laws, when we get more policing, these things don't fix these issues. And we've also seen that if we ask for both of those things, we will only be given more money into law enforcement, more resources given to criminal justice and things of those natures. So we're at 30 minutes here. This next episode, we should finish up this chapter and begin reading chapter 5. So we will be back tomorrow with another episode of Rockford Reading Daily. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on, and see you tomorrow.